If you live in a suburb, you've surely had some neighbors who have been a colossal pain in your ass. For the most part, I've been lucky. I'm friends with Tom and Kathy a house away from us, and at least I'm on neutral ground with everyone else. Well, everyone but Mr. Finster. Mr. Finster was in his 60s and was the type of person that if you said hello to him while he was outside, he would give you just a look and continue whatever he was doing. No nod or even a smile. He had lived in the development longer than we had. I never saw a Mrs. Finster, so I assumed that he had never married. He also didn't seem to work, as I rarely caught him coming or going during my own work commute. My wife and I assumed he was retired, and sometimes when we were bored, we wondered what sort of things he had done for work. Since we knew very little about Mr. Finster, we naturally went the route of, he's probably a serial killer. Whatever he got up to in that house of his, we gathered he didn't have much of a social life. His house was usually dark by 9 p.m., and we rarely ever saw him leave in the evening. He had a car, sure, but it seemed to only get used during the early afternoons, probably when he went to the grocery store or did other errands around town. What little routine he had didn't seem to get him out of the house much. While things at night were always quiet with Mr. Finster, he did have a motion-sensing security light on his back patio that would sometimes wake me up in the middle of the night when a deer or some other kind of animal tripped the sensor. There was a chain-link fence dividing the shared border of our houses, but otherwise, Mr. Finster's yard opened up to the woods. I understood why he had it. When you're older and alone, it's nice to know that if something is approaching your yard, you'll get a warning and a nice bright burst of light. It was extra peace of mind. Usually the light flashing on and off wasn't too big of an annoyance, but lately it had been driving me bonkers, as it had seemed to be going off every night around 3 a.m., and it seemed to stay on for a good while too. I know I wasn't the only one being bothered by the light either. My two kiddos, Lucy and Jacob, mentioned it the next morning. Both of our bedrooms were on the same wall, adjacent to Mr. Finster's house, so our bedroom windows looked directly into his yard from upstairs. My wife slept on the other side of the bed, so when the light went off, she wasn't as bothered by it as I was. His goddamn light was on for like half an hour last night, Jacob said irately as he stabbed at a bowl of cereal. Hey, language, I said, as my wife tried not to laugh. Jacob was in 4th grade, while Lucy was in 3rd grade. We tried to discourage them from using curse words, even if hearing a young child swearing is one of life's greatest treasures. Well, provided you're not playing opposite them in an online video game. I mean, there's no way there are that many animals running through his yard, Jacob continued. Well, maybe he got a dog, said my wife. He does live alone. Maybe he's getting lonely. I've never seen him out walking a dog or anything. Never heard any barking either, I said. I noticed Lucy was quietly pulling apart a piece of toast, eating tiny bites. She had dark circles under her eyes and looked tired. Did the light keep you up last night, Lucy? She nodded and said, I thought I saw something, but I was probably imagining it. I didn't get a good look or anything. Well, what did you see? I said, sipping at my coffee. I thought I saw Mr. Finster standing outside, staring at me. I put my coffee down on the table, sufficiently creeped out. For some reason, anything that's just a little creepy sounds much creepier coming from your child. "Did you happen to take a look, Jacob?" I asked. Jacob shook his head, but I knew his bed was closer to the door than the window. And Lucy was closer to the window because she was afraid of the dark and liked to let the moonlight in. "Well, if Mr. Finster happened to be outside, I'm sure he wasn't actually looking at you, Lucy," I said, trying to reassure her. She nodded, but I could still see there was a mixture of fear and doubt on her pale face. "Let's get you ready for school," my wife said, sliding next to her and helping her get her things together. I finished my coffee and headed into work. When I pulled out of the drive, I hovered in the street for a bit and watched Mr. Finster's house. I don't know what I expected to see, but the house was quiet. That night, the light flashed on again at 3 a.m. I rolled over in bed, cursing. I was a light sleeper, but Mr. Finster's porch light hadn't usually been that much of an issue before. There were plenty of nights where it didn't go off at all, but it seemed like this week he had a new routine. That or an animal kept dancing around on his porch. I checked to see if my wife might have been awake, and in the minutes that followed, the light kicked off. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. Then, the light came on. "Jesus Christ, Finster, what the fuck are you doing out there?" I whispered. I slid out of bed this time and looked out the window through blurry eyes. I grabbed my glasses off the nightstand and had to stop myself from yelling as the world came into focus. Mr. Finster was standing there in his yard, but he wasn't moving. His long shadow crept across the lawn as his back was to the light. Because he was standing with his back to the only source of direct light, I couldn't make out his face or see what he was wearing. The outline of his hair looked about as I remembered, but it was dark out. I wasn't 100% sure it was him. But there wasn't much of a reason for somebody else to be standing out there in his yard at 3 a.m. I leaned down in the corner of the window frame, thinking he might be able to see me if I kept standing there. I kept watching, waiting for him to move or do something, but he didn't. He just remained completely still. Shit, was this guy even breathing? I was so concentrated watching from the corner of the window that I hadn't heard the soft steps on the carpet behind me. "Daddy?" whispered Lucy. I jumped and almost bashed my head on the windowsill. "Jesus, Lucy," I said. "You see him too, don't you, Dad?" she asked, clutching her stuffed Peter Rabbit under her arm. "Yeah, honey, I see him." I had my back to the window, and I noticed that the room had grown dark again. I realized then that it wouldn't be weird if he was just smoking outside. The thought suddenly comforted me. Duh, dipshit. He probably picked up smoking and is just going out for a smoke. But I hadn't seen anything glowing in his hands, like a cigarette. And I could have sworn when I was watching him that he hadn't moved in several minutes. He just remained completely still. I kept pushing the thought out of my head as I walked Lucy back to her bedroom. However, when I rounded the corner in the hallway, I could see by the crack in the door of their room that the light had come on again. "I'm going to look, but you're not going to look, okay?" I told Lucy. She squeezed my hand and I squeezed it back. "Just wait right here." I pushed the bedroom door open all the way, trying not to wake up Jacob, only to find that Jacob was sitting up in his bed, the sheets bunched up under his chin. "Dad," he whispered. The lights keep flickering on and off. The light illuminating the window stopped, turning the room dark again. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the crickets chirp outside. Then I advanced towards the window. I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my chest as I drew closer to the window. It was so silly to suddenly be afraid of your geriatric neighbor being a little weirdo in his yard in the middle of the night. Besides being cold and aloof, it's not like Mr. Finster has a track record for causing problems. I got to the window and scanned outside. With just the moonlight, I couldn't tell if he was back there anymore, but it seemed like he had gone back into his house. I waited for several seconds. Some owls were hooting outside. I glanced up to look at the stars. There was a flash. I stifled a yell. He was standing right up against the fence to his yard. And now I knew for sure that he wasn't just looking, but looking up at the window. Right at me. I backed away from the window. "What did you see, Dad? What did you see?" whispered Jacob. It was then that I realized that Mr. Finster hadn't actually been standing completely still. He had been advancing closer to the house, each time the light went off. There must have been an activation threshold for the light, where it wouldn't flash until motion had been detected for at least a few seconds. One thought chilled me to the bone. What if all this time, he only stopped moving because we saw him? I didn't try to reason with how this could be possible. That was between me and Lucy. He could tell which one of us was tracking him. Red light, green light. "All right, Jacob, we're going down the hall back to Mom and Dad's room, okay?" He slid out of bed and grabbed my hand. I went into the hall and Lucy, who had been peering through the doorway, grabbed my other hand. I stole a glance at the window again and saw that the chain-link fence separating our yard from Mr. Finster's was shaking slightly. With Mr. Finster nowhere to be found. Fuck. As we were about halfway to the bedroom, a loud pounding hammered the front door. The kids screamed. My wife woke up from the commotion, confused, and finally caught up with the rest of us, who were scared shitless. "Stay here with your mom," I said. I went downstairs and grabbed a baseball bat from the closet. Again, Mr. Finster pounded on the door. I got to the door and raised the bat and yelled, "I don't know what your problem is, Finster, but you better fuck off back to your house before I call the police. Do you understand me?" I waited. He didn't knock again. We made a fort of sorts in our bedroom to try and get the kids to sleep, while I stayed up all night long, keeping an eye on Finster's yard. I cradled the bat between my fingers, fighting off the urge to sleep. I told my wife that first thing in the morning, I would call Tom and Kathy to ask if they'd noticed Mr. Finster doing anything weird to them, and then I would file a police report. Maybe in his older age, he finally just fucking lost it. I didn't see him in his yard again that night, and thankfully, the light didn't go off anymore. I snapped awake from my vigil as birds chirped outside, and the early bleat of sunrise crept into view. I waited until 9 a.m., and then I phoned Tom. I knew they were on vacation and might have been asleep, but I needed to talk to somebody about this. Thankfully, Tom answered by the third ring. "Hey Tom, sorry to be bothering you during your vacation, but have you guys been having problems with Mr. Finster? This guy is scaring the bejeebus out of my kids. He just started staring through our windows the other night, and then he just started pounding on our front door and..." Doug, hang on. I could tell he had just woken up, but I kept talking over him. "I'm about to call the cops, man. I really am." "Doug, didn't you hear? he said. And then he said something that changed everything about that night. Mr. Finster died a week ago. Congratulations. You made it out of the Eerie Hollows. Welcome to the other side. You know, I can't state how fun that is for me to say, and I hope it just genuinely scares some people sometimes. You know, I'll tell you something. It's a lot of fun doing these, but it also scares the dog shit out of me. The other night, I was going to take a picture of the moon and include it in one of the title pictures from my video, right? So I got out there in the middle of the night. I could put my camera up. I looked around and I said, nope, and I went back inside. You know, this is actually starting to get to me. These are really fun to do, but it's starting to mess with my head a little bit. Why did I just say that? Well, anyway, thank you so much for listening again. If you would be so inclined, please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. As you probably saw in the beginning, we have a new Instagram for the YouTube page. It's at the Eerie Hollows with 3 E's in there because I didn't plan this out very well. Thanks again, and remember,
be scared. Be very scared.